And in the next part of this reed saga, I'm going to be talking about Vandoren reeds. I'm sure you'll agree, one of the biggest manufacturers in the reed department. Of course, they're well known for producing clarinet reeds as well as saxophone reeds and some of the finest accessories in the world. So I'm going to kick things off by talking about the standard Vandoren traditional reed, or the blue box as it's sort of commonly known. And just to tell you a little bit about this reed, it's a good all-round sort of broad sounding reed. It's got a very thin tip, but they've got a lot of body in the spine, so a lot more wood in the center of the reed, which gives it this sort of darker core sound. So it's a nice all-round reed, commonly used in classical music, but at the same time it can work in jazz styles too. So let's give this one a go. Yeah, very nice. So it's got a very pleasant all-round sound. It's very easy to articulate and produce the sound. I didn't feel like I was fighting against it. Just a nice natural all-round sound. So next up we've got the Vandoren V12 reed, and this has been produced for saxophone following on from the success of its use in the clarinet world. And for clarinet, as you might obviously think, there's a little bit more use in terms of classical music, and I suppose that same thinking can be applied to using a V12 in the saxophone idiom. So I think of it personally as a little bit more of a classical reed. There's a lot of resistance and stiffness in the reed. It's got a long vamp, a long scrape, but there's a lot more wood critically in the tip, which gives it a harder response. And I think it just makes it more suitable when you bring the tip opening in a little bit and play perhaps on a bit more of a classical setup. But for those who like a certain amount of resistance in terms of jazz styles, you could try it on this kind of setup. Personally, I think I'm going to find it a little tougher now, so let's just give it a bit of a blast. Okay, my diaphragm was working a little bit overtime there, you might hear it. So definitely resistant. A nice overall tone, but you have to work for it more. But I think this probably isn't the perfect setup to demonstrate this reed, so I was just sort of struggling, hanging on to the end of the sort of musical sentences there. But you get the idea. It's got a nice sort of overall core sound, a bit more resistance. Try it on perhaps a different mouthpiece setup and you might get better results there. So now we've got the Vandoren Java reeds, and first of all we've got the green Java reeds, defined by having an unfiled profile. They differ slightly from the red Javas, as I'll come to in a minute, but the characteristics of the green Javas are that it's got this long, flexible scrape, or vamp as it's technically known, so a lot of material removed from the whole thing, but it has a thicker tip to sort of balance it out. The overall effect is that it's very responsive, very flexible, quite bright, very immediate. When you really push it, you feel a certain amount of buzz there, but it's very responsive when you're playing quieter as well. So it makes it very popular for sort of popular music styles, jazz as well perhaps. So let's give this one a blast. You can see how much easier it is to continue playing on a reed that responds and vibrates as easily as this reed here. Very responsive, on the same amount of sort of breath input as the previous reed. I could just go for a lot longer. You might say the sound's just a little bit too buzzy. I think you could refine that by maybe going upper grade in strength, for example, or just slightly adjusting the position of the reed on the mouthpiece, but very responsive, very easy to play. So next we've got the red Java, which, as I just sort of inferred earlier, very similar to the green Java, but the obvious thing is that it has a filed cut. But beyond that, there's also a few other little sort of minute changes in the scrape in comparison to its sister reed, the green Java. There's a little bit more wood in the spine of the reed. It's still got this long flexible cut, so you get that sort of flexible approach, but there's a little bit more body in there, so I think we'll find a bit more resistance as I give it a go now. Yes, it's definitely got more of a sort of woodiness in there. For me, I feel like I just need to break through a little bit more. I think, again, as I've pointed out several times, all of these reeds will sound more at their optimum when you break them in a bit more. I've had about sort of 10 minutes on all of them before shooting these videos. Really need a little bit more, but you still get the very obvious tonal characteristics, and hopefully you can hear the difference between the red and the green Java as demonstrated there. So next we've got the Vandoren V16, and as the website infers, this reed was designed to answer the demands of some of the American jazz musicians of the time when it was developed. And in terms of the scrape, it's got a thicker tip, but it's also got, again, a long scrape here, just to balance it out. Now, the resulting effect is quite a sort of modern, bright, percussive reed. So if you're in those sort of situations where you're really trying to cut through and your sort of more warm sounding reeds are just, although they're sounding lovely, just aren't cutting it, something like this could easily do the trick for you. So let's give this one a go. Yeah, it's certainly got an edge there. Even down at the bottom, it's got a certain amount of sort of kick and bite to it in the sound. So I think it definitely does what it says on the tin. So now we've got the Vandoren ZZ. If you like, those two letters have been taken from the word jazz, so you can think of it as their purely jazz reed. And this one is very responsive. It's responsive, but it also has a certain amount of core to it. Kind of reminds me of the Select Jazz to an extent within D'Addario's reeds. It's got that same kind of feel to it, so it's a good all-rounder. So it's got that sort of medium thick spine down the middle if you want to get technical, but then a nice amount of cane taken off from the side as well, giving it that flexibility. Yeah, so again, it's another one of these reeds where it's easy to play. You can carry on a little bit longer on the same breath. It's got that sort of response to it. And I think it's got that sort of the colour and the flexibility and the sound that I just previously described as well. And finally, in the line of Vandoren reeds, we've got the V21, a relative newcomer. And this reed is unfiled. And they describe it as having a conical shape as well to the scrape. So I think that's where it tapers off a little bit at the side. I mean, that's the standard cut that you'd see on reeds anyway, having this tapering off at the side and more reed down the middle. But that's the way they pick it out in their description, Vandoren that is. In terms of its sound, it's sort of got a centered feel to it. Again, a little bit more suitable for classical music. It's got that depth and darkness that you would have in a classical setup. But at the same time, it's got a lot of obvious projection, which I found when I was experimenting with it. And I think you can even hear that on a jazz setup. Make it, again, maybe a possible crossover reed for the jazz setups as well as the classical styles. Yeah, so I think it's got all of that in there. There's a certain amount of depth and body in there, as well as having that feeling that it would work on those closer tip mouthpieces for that classical sort of focus and darkness in the sound as well. So that concludes my take on all of the Vandoren reeds that you see before you here. I've tried through all, what have we got here, 7 cuts, and I'm sure you'll agree there's tonal differences and response differences in all of them, so hopefully you found this informative. We're about halfway through our reeds saga, and I'm going to talk about some of the other reeds that we offer in my next video.